Well, welcome everyone to the final Friday forum before the summer break. And it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome clarinetist Dimitri Ashkenazy. Dimitri has performed with numerous string quartets, including the Kadai, Heath, Ives, and Endylion quartets, and with partners including his brother Vovka and his father, internationally recognized solo pianist, chamber music performer and conductor Vladimir Ashkenazy. On tour, Dimitri has appeared at the Royal Festival Hall in London and with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, at the Hollywood Bowl with the Deutsche Symphonie Orchestra in Berlin, and at the Sydney Opera House with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. In addition to the major concertos for clarinet, his repertoire extends to include Peter Maxwell Davies' Strathclyde Concerto No. 4, which he has performed with the composer, conducting in Spain, Germany, Hungary, and the UK, including a very moving performance at the 2014 proms on Max's birthday, which was the 8th of September. And that was to be just 18 months before Max's death in March 2016. Dimitri also gave the world premiere performance at the 2004 Lucerne Festival of Max's clarinet quintet, Hymn to Artemis Lockyer, with the Brodski Quartet. The clarinet part for the Strathclyde 4 concerto has been uploaded to a share drive, and Dimitri has asked me to share this with you today because he will be referring to the score in his talk. And I'll pop the link for the score in the chat in a moment. And there will be plenty of time at the end of the session to ask Dimitri any questions that you might have. But without further ado, I would like to pass on to Dimitri.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, Nick, for having me here. It's interesting that you mentioned that I performed at the Royal Festival Hall with the Royal Philharmonic, because in fact, one of the first concerts I gave in the UK was with Peter Maxwell Davies' clarinet concerto, the Strathclyde No. 4, with Max himself conducting. That was in March of 1994. And that's soon after I first met him. I met Max, in fact, about half a year before that, little under half a year before that, because I'd been asked by Harrison Parrott, the concert agency, to perform this piece. And it wasn't in my repertoire, as you can imagine. I was only 24 at the time. And I was still going through lots of other repertoire. And but of course I accepted. I mean, it's a date at the Royal Festival Hall, and then with a major London orchestra, and I thought, well, of course I'll do it. And then I got the part, and the part was, let's say, a lot more challenging than just about anything I had performed before that. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to meet the composer Max before the actual date. And I'd already started practicing it, I think, in October or so for a March date. And I found out that he was going to be in Switzerland soon after that, and arranged via different middlemen, middlewomen to meet him while he was there. And he graciously gave me a 45-minute slot at his hotel in Lausanne. He was conducting the Lausanne Chamber Orchestra. And the interesting thing was, Judy Arnold, his manager, met me at the door, and we walked in, and before too long we were sitting sipping tea, and I started talking a little bit about the piece, and I had my part with me, and we went through a couple of passages, how he envisioned them, how he wanted them to be heard, and everything was all very nice, and he was wonderfully eloquent, soft-spoken, but spoke beautiful English. Something I'm a language lover, and it was lovely for me to hear somebody speak English so beautifully. And about 45 minutes later, I left the hotel, and I couldn't really say that I'd been reassured in any way, because it was just a really, really difficult piece, and there was nothing he could really tell me that was going to help me too much overcome the technical challenges. And one thing that did stick out, though, was that on the subject of a particularly challenging, not to say impossible passage, I asked him point blank, how much of this do you want played? Because I genuinely believe that at the tempo marked and with the number of notes supposed to be played per beat, that I wasn't going to be able to actually render what was written faithfully. And he said immediately, without missing a beat, he answered, well, as much as possible. And it was something that I later realized was something so typically Max, because I think he really appreciated the effort put in by the performer to render what he wrote, as much as whether that actually came off or not. And I think that's something that also was resurrected a little later when I spoke to a good friend of mine, a cellist from South Africa called Francois Leroux, who is an improviser. He's become a bit of an improviser, and he's a classically trained cellist and pianist, and has gone into improvisation, dances, sings, plays, and has come somewhat to be suspicious of, or regard in a slightly less favorable way, written music, in that it's not really happening in the moment. That, of course, is another conversation, and one that can be had and can be debated. But what Max said then, I thought, was symbolic for what we as classical musicians try to do in the first place, which is we struggle to perform something that has been given us, a challenge that has been set, and the effort that we put in, and our attempts to climb that mountain, as it were, I think are something deeply human, and something that is something that we see as well in sports personalities, or in mountain climbers, or in people who swim the channel, or anything like that. We see a struggle to achieve something, and there's something wonderful about that in live concerts, which you can't really have in almost anything else in our field, in classical music. We can make recordings, we can make them clean, we can make them perfect, as it were, but the effect of a live performance, and that struggle, and perceiving and feeling that struggle that the performers are going through, and when it comes off, the joy, I think is something extremely powerful. And that's why I still believe that live concerts are not going to die out. Anyway, but back to Max. As I say, he struck me as a soft-spoken, very eloquent, somewhat bird-like character. He both looked a little bit like a bird and looked with his eyes a little bit like a bird as well. And he seemed quietly confident, not arrogant, but confident that what he was doing was worthwhile. And his vocation, I think he was absolutely where he felt he should be, writing music and expressing himself in that way. So anyway, after that meeting, as I say, I went out still feeling a little bit challenged, which was not a bad thing. For the next 3 months, I practiced the blazes out of that piece and did my best. And I decided that I was going to play the piece by memory. I had, up to that point, played every concerto I'd performed by memory. And this one was a particular challenge, of course, not just because of the part itself, but because the part in its relation to the orchestra didn't show any, or almost didn't show any easily discernible meeting points, places where you absolutely know that you're together, and where you feel comfortable and reassured. that things are going in the right direction. And this meant, or at least the first time you play it, at this point, after having performed the piece now several times, I know much better which things to listen for, of course. But at the time, it was a huge challenge. And this meant that because Max was going to be conducting, I was going to have to rely on his beat quite a lot. So to know the meter of each bar and to know exactly where his beat was. And I was pleasantly and wonderfully surprised at the fact that not only did he know his piece exceedingly well and had taken the job of organizer in this sense, of conductor, extremely seriously, but his beat was wonderfully precise. It was very economical, and he was rhythmically exceedingly precise, and also in his movements, in his gestures, very clear. And that was wonderfully reassuring for me at the first rehearsal, realizing that I could depend on him entirely to know where I was in relation to the orchestra. And I have to say, not all composers are like that. Many composers don't really know terribly well, once they've given their piece to the performer, what it's supposed to sound like, even on some occasions. Or if they're conducting, they're not particularly great conductors. And as I say, Max was wonderful in that regard, because he actually knew very well what was happening and knew how much both the orchestra and the soloists were going to have to depend on him. So the rehearsals went well. The concert actually went very well. And even though it did, I have to say that I left the hall, I left that meeting, Max was 60 at the time, thinking that that could possibly be the only time I would play the piece. As I said before, I was still in the process of learning a number of pieces which are considered staples in the clarinet repertoire. I'd never performed the Finzi concerto, for instance, at that point. I'd never performed the Jean-Français concerto. I'd only had my first Nielsen concerto the previous year. And there were many things that I still knew that I was going to have to learn. And playing Strathclyde No. 4 was not necessarily at the top of my priority list. But it was therefore quite a lovely surprise when a few years later I got another call from Harrison Parrott asking if I would go and play it again with Max conducting in Spain, in Santiago de Compostela and in A Coruña, with the, I think it was the Real Filarmónica of Galicia. And this was in 2000, and I think if I remember correctly, it was only with about half a year's notice. And remembering how much I'd had to invest in preparing the piece the first time round, I was a little bit wary of doing it at only 6 months' notice. But I accepted. Of course, it was a great honor to play with him again and to play the piece again. And it was then, I think, that especially after the second concert, that I was first really touched by the piece, and where I felt that this was not going to be my last time. And I remember the quiet joy of getting to the coda, and this sense of having completed a journey when you get there, and that it's a journey worth making, that made me think at the time, and it turned out to be true, that it was not likely to be my last performance, as I had thought the one 6 years previously was going to be. It's magical, the end of that piece. And a friend of Max's who was actually there and came to the second concert, apparently I looked up to the heavens at the very end of the piece, and he asked me why I'd done it. And I suppose something in me, we all, I suppose, look for the eternal in some way, whether it's in a religious way or in a spiritual way, or even a philosophical way, or an astronomical way even. And I think I somewhat instinctively realized that there's a bit of an eternal moment at the end of the piece, something really quite special, which you don't find in so many pieces. Even of the greatest composers, you don't sometimes find such a moment. And here I felt I'd found one, and it was a lovely thing to discover and to feel that I would like to play the piece again. And I don't know how many performers are listening. It's quite difficult to place a piece by a contemporary composer unless you're really famous, to place it in a concert program or in a concert season or with an orchestra, especially when your instrument is not necessarily the first solo instrument people think of. People tend to think of piano, violin, cello in that order, and then maybe flute, clarinet, and then maybe the odd trumpet or something. But we clarinetists, if we're allowed to play a concerto, we usually have to play something like Mozart or Weber. If we're lucky, maybe the odd Finzi, Copeland, Francais, Nielsen, but that's where our repertoire tends to run into quite heavy obstacles. So for a while, at least, this piece was going to be something that was, if Max was out there conducting it himself, it was going to be on my concert schedule. The following years, this was in 2000, and the next performance of the Strathclyde was 4 years thence. But in the meantime, in 2001-02, I'd been given an open invitation by Judy Arnold, who was Max's manager at the time. She lived near Earl's Court Station with her husband, Michael, and she had said basically anytime I was in town, I was welcome to come and stay. And I sometimes had concerts in the UK, and I was more than happy to take her up on her offer. And of course, every now and then Max would be there as well. And I met Colin, his longtime partner in the last stages of his life. And it was great to spend time with them, to share meals with them, and to enjoy moments of intense conversations and a lot of laughter. They were great to hang around with. And it was during that time that we started thinking about possibly getting a clarinet quintet written. Max was keen on the idea, and we needed to find a sponsor. We needed to find a date, and then the date was found at the Lucerne Festival in 2004. I think, Nick, you mentioned that at the beginning. And with the Brodsky Quartet, I was performing a lot with the Brodsky Quartet at the time, which is part of the reason I was in London quite a lot. And I asked them if they were open, and they were. And so we set the date, and then Ian Kraft, who was a fertility doctor, specializing in helping couples who couldn't conceive make babies, basically. And he came in and said that he would commission the piece. And that was set then for August, September of 2004. The next Strathclyde actually was in June of 2004. So I found myself in March or so of that year, realizing that just as I got the part for the quintet, which was even more difficult than the concerto, inconceivably for me at the time, but it was. So I found myself having to prepare both those pieces for that summer, which was quite monstrous for me. And I have to say that I don't think I played the quintet decently until the following year, when I played it in California with the Ives Quartet, who were amazingly also open to the idea and interested in performing it during the US premiere. And then I think in April of 2005, I started coming to terms with the quintet, which is really difficult as a chamber music work, but also the clarinet part is huge. I remember thinking, Max, why can't you just write a piece that I can just play? that, okay, I'll have to practice, but not that I'm terrified of it when I go out there to play it. But anyway, that's just a little aside. In fact, the Strathclyde of the summer of 2004 was possibly my best effort at that. I was already starting to feel comfortable with it. It was the fourth performance I gave. And as I said before, I was starting to get to understand more of the structure, more of what to listen for, and playing it more as a chamber music work than as a purely soloistic work. That same year, in fact, Max and I, just after the premiere of the quintet, performed together for the only time with my not playing his concerto. I played the Mozart in a concert in Berlin. And that was lovely. It was lovely to interact with him as a musician, and not only as a composer, or as purely as a musician and not as a composer, let's put it that way. One of the pieces that was on the program, though, was a Spell for Green Corn. I don't know if anybody listening here knows that piece. It's a lovely, more light-hearted version of Max, a bit like Orkney Wedding with Sunrise, or some of his lighter works for violin and orchestra. And there's a lovely melody in that, which I, goofy as I am, put into my cadenza of the Mozart concerto in that performance. And Max afterwards said he couldn't believe it when he looked around at me during the performance, like, what in the world are you doing? And I thought that was a lot of fun, and he did too. And I think he really appreciated the gesture, and I think he appreciated the humor in it. He was that kind of guy. And then we did one more performance of the Strathclyde in Budapest that year, and the following year we had a couple more quintets, including the UK premiere in Cheltenham. And in fact, we recorded the quintet for Max's website, Max Opus, which I'm hoping now to, this in a small aside, I'm hoping to release a CD of the Strathclyde and the quintet. The quintet was recorded then, and I've listened to it, and I think it's probably okay. And the concerto I recorded this year in Hagen, and I'm in the process of collecting funding for that. If anybody's interested in contributing to that, I'm more than grateful, and it would be great to get the CD released possibly next year. Also, Colin and Max had insisted that I had to go and visit them on Orkney. So the year after the premiere of the quintet, so in the summer of 2005, I went to visit them on Sanday. And Colin had just bought a couple of bicycles and very kindly let me use one to cycle from their end of Sanday right the way to the other end, which with tailwind was fantastic. And then biking back to their place was a little less fantastic, as you can imagine. I'm an avid cyclist, and I loved it anyway, but it was a bit of a struggle to get back. Max's cooking was fantastic. We enjoyed some lovely moments there. And I remember one of the things we talked about then was vegetarianism, because of course they were not vegetarians. I am, and so they had to adapt their meals, or Max had to adapt his cooking to me, which was very kind of him. And we talked about the fact that there were some birds, swans in particular, who would fly past their house on the coast and land on a small lake very close to where they lived. There was a small Sweetwater lake very close to the coast, and their house happened to be in between the two. There was also, unfortunately for the swans, an electrical or telephone cable, which they would frequently see a little bit too late. And it would, every now and then, stop a swan in mid-flight, and sometimes the swan would kill itself. And we got to talking about whether a vegetarian would eat such a swan. and why not. And this, independently of the fact that swans apparently are royal birds and belong to the crown, and therefore if one were to take such a dead swan and consume it, it would actually be against the law. But that was something else. So I remember that conversation. It got me thinking a lot about what my version of vegetarianism is and what anybody else's might be, and the reasons for doing it. And very interesting conversations we had anyway. The last time I saw Colin was a few years after that. We had one last Strathclyde together in Amsterdam, and that was in late 2009. So Max was just over 75 then. And as it turned out, it was going to be the last time I saw Colin, because they separated not so long after that, and Colin sadly took his own life only a little while after their separation. And then I had one more performance of the Strathclyde, as Nick mentioned in the introduction, at the 80th birthday prom for Max, which he invited me personally for, to play his piece, although he was then not going to be conducting. It was Ben Jernan who conducted. And I think that's perhaps the greatest honor a composer can give you, to ask you to come and play his piece, which you played with him several times, which he knows your interpretation of it, he knows how you play it, and he invites you to play it at such an important concert. I think that was a massive deal for me, and it was at the Royal Albert Hall, and I think I've almost never been as nervous as I was then, neither before nor since. Max was already quite ill at that point with leukemia, although you wouldn't have known. He was buzzing around as usual, 80 years old and everything. But only a year and a half later, he was gone. And I didn't get to see him anymore after that evening, sadly. But the reason I wanted to go ahead with this recording was because of this this connection I had with him and with the piece, and the growing love I have of it. And so when I had the chance to perform it twice in Hagen in Germany with Joseph Trafton, I asked him if he was open to the idea of recording the two concerts and possibly doing a correction session. And he was, and we didn't really have enough rehearsal time, unfortunately. But they kindly gave me the extra session in the form of their general rehearsal for the second concert. So I got to use the entire 3 hours just to do corrections, and it was really, really nice of them. And that we did 4 months ago in February this year. And as I say, I'm hoping that we'll find the funding now to do the editing and the post-production. And now a little bit about the piece itself. It's called Strathclyde Concerto No. 4, which, as the name suggests, is the fourth in a series of concertos. There are 10 altogether. And Max was commissioned by the Strathclyde Regional Council in the mid-1980s to write these concertos. And the number 1 is for oboe and orchestra, number 2 for cello and orchestra, number 3 is a double concerto for horn and trumpet, and the 4th is for clarinet. And just for purposes of completeness, the remaining 6 are violin viola, then flute, then double bass, then bassoon, and then a sort of concerto grosso for piccolo, alto flute, cor anglais, E-flat clarinet, bass clarinet, and contrabassoon. And finally, a concerto for orchestra in the mold of the Bartók or Lutosławski. In fact, the first performance of that last concerto for orchestra was the year after the Strathclyde Regional Council, the actual commissioner, was abolished, strangely. The orchestration of the 10 concertos varies widely. There's a tendency to reduce the solo instruments colleagues in the orchestra. So in fact, in number 4, in the clarinet concerto, there are no clarinets in the orchestra, but there is one bass clarinet, which kind of covers the very low register of that particular sound that he was looking for. Otherwise, the orchestration for the clarinet concerto is fairly, one could consider, normal. It has a tendency to have more in the bass than in the soprano registers throughout the piece. And there's a lot of percussion. There's especially resonant percussion in crotales, marimba, and a Japanese gong at the very end in the coda. So a lot of the orchestration sounds a little murky or dark. And then with the other extreme, some glittery and bright sounding passages as well, with that percussion and with some high flutes as well. And the clarinet writing leaps from one to the other. There's an awful lot of low register writing, and there's a huge amount of very, very high writing as well, and a lot of jumping between them and arpeggios and what have you. Basically, just an awful lot of notes as well. Using all these textures and colors, Max wrote a piece which is in search of its theme, so to speak. It's looking for its main theme. It looks for its main theme for about a half hour, until the last minute or two of the entire concerto. It's looking for this melody, and we're trying to find the right pronunciation for this. Let me just make sure that I'm still on here. Is everyone still on?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I just hadn't heard anything for a while. I just wanted to make sure that we're still on. So I'm still not sure how to pronounce the name of the melody. It means a lament for the harp tree, and I think it's pronounced something in Scottish Gaelic. It's pronounced something like Cua Crev Nantir. If anybody's listening who knows how to pronounce it correctly, please make yourselves known. The melody goes something like this. So it's in a slow 3. He writes it in F sharp major. Apparently he heard this in Edinburgh, if what I've read is true, in the Scottish Parliament building, which at the time didn't actually house a Scottish Parliament. And it was written by a man called Morrison. And in fact, Max wrote this piece for a man called Morrison, for the principal clarinet of the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. And as I say, this melody is something that is only vaguely perceived for about half an hour of the piece, and only comes in this form at the very end in the coda. So there are many places where you get an inkling of what might be coming later on. Like at the very beginning of the piece, for those of you who have the part, the introduction is marked lento. There are about 10 bars of very slow, murky sounding textures. And the clarinet's first entry after the second fermata is like this. So we already have this from the melody. We have a slight distortion with this leap. And this leap comes in a couple of places later on as well. But apart from that, he takes snippets of this melody, especially the dotted rhythm, and the grace note effect of, and he puts things like at the very beginning, at figure 1. So you already have the leap and the dotted rhythm, except it's no longer in 3/4, it's in 2/4 plus 7/8 plus 3/4 plus 7/8. And that's just at the very beginning. Excuse me a moment. Everybody still there? Then at figure 4, for instance, you have so again the leap. It's close to, and yet if you haven't heard the melody yet, you're probably not yet aware of it. And part of the reason why I played the melody first, so that you have a bit of an idea. At figure 8, again, for those of you, let me see if I can find now figure 8. Yes, at figure 8, he brings it in a 6/8. Again, the da 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 da. It's like the da 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 da. And at figure 12, I'll just keep throwing these excerpts at you. And these are all things that are just in the clarinet part. There are things like this in many of the orchestral instrumentalists' parts as well. There's one particularly colorful tutti with all the strings, da 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 da, where he does something like that as well. And then towards the end of this fast section, which I could call the first movement, although the movements go into one another without a break. But before the slow part starts, he brings it in 12/16. And if that wasn't enough, just a few bars later, he brings it in 7/16. And you kind of get the feeling that it's going towards an absurd end. He's taken the melody to such an extreme that it's almost no longer, even if you know it, it's getting difficult to understand that's actually still connected to this gorgeous melody. He then goes into the long, slow movement, which is perhaps the most murky, the most lugubrious section. And even there are little snippets where you can, if you remember the melody, you'll remember that that's the motive. It's really slow, and yet you can sort of make it out. Just after that, he goes into a huge theme and variation, you could call it, except it's a 27-bar theme, which has a 27-bar variation, which goes up into the stratospheres of the clarinet's register. And in the variation, he really varies. There are so many notes in it. It's I think the most difficult part of the piece. And he finishes on a huge scale, ending up on a high sounding B natural in the third octave, which is written D natural in the fourth for the A clarinet, which leads it into the cadenza. And again, the cadenza is full of these things, these little motives, these dotted rhythms, pardon me. And especially in the second half of the cadenza, we get closer and closer to, it's like the fog is lifting slowly. And I'll tell you a little bit about what the imagery I thought of while I was explaining this piece to the audience in Hagen this February. Second half of the cadenza is something like then towards the very end of the cadenza, let me see if I can bring out a high D here. And then just after that, when things have calmed down to such an extent, he then moves into, he ends up on a high written C sharp in the fourth octave, which is sounding A sharp in the third octave, which is the major third then of the F sharp major, into which he then brings us magically with the double basses holding a C sharp pedal for almost the entire length of the coda. And you can just imagine you end up on this, or rather, that the double basses are holding the whole way through, and then and there is something really enchanting about that moment. And speaking of enchanting, I had the idea that you could compare this concerto's journey a little bit to, for those of you who know Tolkien and who know The Lord of the Rings, it's not quite the same thing, of course, and it's not, maybe not quite as complicated, but I thought of a little girl who needs to find a certain, let's say, herb or flower or tree, because it's an essential ingredient for a potion which will save her grandmother's life. And she can't see that tree yet. She knows where it is and she knows what it smells like. And every now and again, she'll get a little whiff of it on the wind, and she'll think that she's going in the right direction. And maybe sometimes the whiff is a little stronger and she'll feel encouraged and she'll keep going. But there are evil forces trying to stop her, and they're making her life very difficult. And although at first she feels that she's going to make it and she's feeling quite confident, then the second movement starts, let's say, and she feels more and more despondent, and she feels that maybe she's not going to make it, and she's getting tired and she's getting hungry and it's cold and it's horribly difficult. The terrain is more difficult. She has to walk through snow or very big rocks, boulders, you name it, terrible weather. And when you get to the cadenza, she's exhausted. And yet she's still there. She's still alive and she can still walk. And she's starting to feel that maybe she's got through the worst and maybe she's going to make it. And then you get to the end of the cadenza and she can see the tree and she can collect what she needs, and she knows that she's going to save her grandmother. It's a very, very quick image, and it's not perfect, but it does have something of that. And what occurred to me after that concert, and when I was starting to prepare for this talk, was that maybe it's a little far-fetched, but maybe Max even related this piece, or you could make an argument that it could be related to this piece, that Scotland is a bit like that. Scotland is a country full of very jovial, people who like their food and drink, and people who like to have a good time with their mates, and very much nature loving, and who have had an extremely difficult time over the centuries, and who at the time Max wrote this piece didn't have their own parliament, and might actually end up finding their peace and their freedom. Maybe that's a little far-fetched, but it just occurred to me that the piece somehow has some kind of closure at the end. You feel the journey is made, we've arrived, and we can take a deep breath, and we're going to be okay. And that's a lovely feeling to have at the end of a piece of music. So that's the end of my main part. Is anybody interested in asking anything or talking?
Yes, absolutely. I've got lots of questions. No, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating talk. I mean, your personal reflections and recollections of Max are really wonderful to hear, and I think we can all relate to what you were saying about his bird-like character and those piercing eyes. Yes, yeah. For those of us who have had the good fortune to meet him, can certainly understand where you're coming from there. I mean, yes, I really enjoyed the analytical insights into the piece as well. Thank you so much for that. I mean, that coda is absolutely beautiful, isn't it? It is stunning, and you do get that sense of closure in this piece, and you don't always get that with Max. There's always that more often than not, there's a question mark rather than a full stop there, I think. But it really is enchanting. My question really is what you were referring to quite early on in the talk, which I found really fascinating, actually, and that's Max's conducting.
Yes.
Because that has come in for a lot of criticism in the past, actually. He wasn't the greatest conductor, according to some people. And he even said himself that he conducted his own pieces in the 1960s because no one else would. And in his diaries, there's a strong indication there that he didn't particularly like conducting. So that's really fascinating to hear that your testimony has so to speak, saying that he had a very precise and very clear in terms of the performer's point of view. Could you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I can only give my perspective. I mean, as a soloist, if you're playing a piece which is, as I mentioned, which is not immediately audibly how can I put this? For somebody who's not played the piece before, it's not immediately audibly organized, and it's difficult to rely purely on your ears. And I tend to be somebody who relies much more on his ears than many others, and less on analysis of the score. But I love to react to people's playing immediately and go with them. I'm very much a chamber musician in that. And of course, in a piece like this, playing it for the first time, there was very little chance of doing that. So what I needed more than anything was to know precisely at what point in the bar I was. And I found that I could rely completely on his gestures. I found them to be very, as I said before, economical. There was not anything that was excessive. There was nothing that was superfluous to requirements. And it was precise. I felt that my feeling of rhythm was perfectly mirrored in his gestures. Now, what of course I can't address in that kind of assessment is how much he was able to convey musically with his conducting, particularly in pieces that were not his own. But as far as the purely technical and rhythmical sides of conducting are concerned, I can only admire them from him, because I think it was exactly, he was the perfect organizer for my requirements.
Okay, thank you. Tara, you've got a question.
Well, hello, and thank you, Dimitri, for your engaging talk. I've got a question. Obviously, you've been fortunate enough to play not only the Strathclyde number 4, but also work again on, the clarinet quintet, which was obviously written sometime later. To what extent do you think Max's clarinet writing differs between the two pieces? Had his clarinet writing evolved? To what extent is the second piece more idiomatic or less idiomatic in terms of being a piece of clarinet writing?
I don't think Max wrote particularly for the clarinet. I think he thought of the clarinet part as something, I'll use the word abstract, although I don't really like it, but I think he did somewhat take it away from the actual instrument playing it and just write it as a piece of absolute music. I also think that he, having heard me play the concerto, seemed to have got the idea that I was happy playing up in the stratosphere. And I have to say, I mean, he pushed it even higher. He went up to a high E, a written E in the 4th octave. That's sounding C sharp in the 4th octave and in the quintet. And I have to say that I found myself having to look for alternative material, because the mouthpiece I normally play simply couldn't take it, or I couldn't take it on that mouthpiece. So I had to look for different things, and that's part of what made me remark before that I wondered why he couldn't just write me a piece of music that I could just play and enjoy, rather than having to struggle so much. But I think part of his clarinet writing was that he wanted the performer to be challenged. I think he wanted the clarinetist to be challenged, and I think, having heard me perform his concerto, he thought that it needed a little extra challenge. So his writing evolved, in a sense, in that direction. Otherwise, I couldn't really say that the clarinet writing in and of itself was greatly different in the quintet from what it was in the concerto. I think that the textures are also very different, with only a string quartet rather than the deep strings and the double bassoon and the bass clarinet in the concerto. I think that changes quite a lot as well in terms of what the clarinet can and should play with that kind of accompaniment. The quintet is very, it's more transparent in texture than the concerto is. So the clarinet writing reflects that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Richard, did you want to say something?
Yes and no. One or two things struck me for that. The fact of the melody coming right at the end, it could be something that's not just that work. The one that comes to mind is Ave Maristella, actually.
Oh, okay.
Where the same thing happens effectively. You only get the sort of resolution at the end of that. So I was actually, while you were talking, I was looking to see if I had any notes to see if there was any connection between them, but I didn't find it in that space of time.
When was that written?
1976, that was.
Okay, well before, okay.
Well before, yes. But that's not unusual in Max's case to find things recurring throughout, sort of things that come back into prominence after some time, in fact, it can be years afterwards. And he was very conscious of the connections that he was making. He knew about them. He thought through, and sometimes were biographical connections as well, which is an interesting aspect of.
I'd love to listen to that.
I also wanted to echo the things that Nick was saying about his view of his own conducting, which comes over very strongly in the diaries. That he feels that he's not competent at all.
Mm.
He uses the word incompetent a couple of times, as I can remember. An interesting observation about the tune is also to be found in a piece by Eric Chisholm, the Scottish composer of the 1930s. But I don't think Max would have known that, as it happens. Although he was well versed, but I've never seen any reference to that. The one thing I did want to, just for a bit of lightheartedness, there was the Swans that you referred to.
Yes.
Well, back in 2009, there was a report in the paper. I'd quite like to read it because it's so typical of Mac's humour, if you don't mind. One recent example came when he found a dead swan by his Orkney house and decided to cook it. Yeah. Only to have 3 policemen knock at the door with a warrant to search his refrigerator on the ground that British swans are the personal property of the monarch. He, of course, was master of the Queen's music at that point. As it turned out, he had committed no offence because the swan was A, from Canada, and B, dead. But it still made news, not least because, as Max said, I found the whole thing funny and invited the policeman in for some swan terrine, which rather horrified them. That was a mistake, wasn't it?
Yeah. So that sounds absolutely like him.
Yes. So just to reflect the kind of personality that we're dealing with, this sort of mercurial personality that comes over and sit in both in terms of his intellectual abilities, but also his self-doubt. Because the whole thing is tied up with the way in which, and I'm not surprised that his response to you was to play what you want, because he understood very clearly from his own compositional experience that people found things difficult or found things hard to assimilate, and so he would want it to communicate, but at the same time, he was conscious that his communication skills weren't always what he wanted them to be. So it's an interesting sort of what's the word I'm looking for? We sort of idea of parallel things going on in what you said there.
And I think part of what I took it to mean was that there was a certain effect that he was looking for, which was going to be achieved by the attempt at playing what he'd written. And it was not necessarily about having the exact sequence of notes reproduced, but the performer's attempt at playing that sequence of notes that was going to create something that he was looking for.
Yes.
Which is a fascinating approach to composition altogether, and that fascinated me, the way that he replied to that.
Nick.
I just wanted to return to the coda again.
Okay.
And the tonality there of F sharp major. I mean, Max comes back to various tonalities, modalities, or focal points throughout his career, and D is a very significant one for him, but so was F sharp, and I think F sharp has some kind of symbolic meaning for him, and I think, Richard, you've done some work on this, so maybe you could just
well, give me a minute, because I can't remember the exact symbolism, but I'll come back to it if you don't mind.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, maybe the actual key there, which he chooses to end the piece in, and constantly refers to with the C sharp, which of course is the dominant, could be significant in this instance. And did Max say anything to you about the key at the end there?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's something that has gone through my head as well. The key of F sharp altogether. I mean, I don't know how much you know of Scriabin's music, but Scriabin wrote a lot of pieces in the most ridiculous keys. And I think part of that was, I mean, in Scriabin's case for sure, was a quest looking for boundaries, pushing the boundaries, looking for something possibly eternal. And F sharp major is as far away as you can get from what we all grow up with the middle C on the piano.
Yes.
And I think it could make sense that that has something of eternity or had something of eternity for him. And that was why he would end a piece like this in that key. But I didn't actually ask him about it, so I don't know.
No, that's a fascinating interpretation of that sense of eternity.
Yes, I would go with that too, actually, yeah, on the basis of all the things that we've read and seen about his views on tonality. But not that I've ever seen it written quite like that. But there's so much symbolism in Max that it's actually quite difficult to unpick sometimes.
Yeah. There definitely is something of that when you get there and you're playing this thing. And I really don't think it would feel the same if you ended up there and it was in E flat major. I don't think it would feel the same. And it has something eternal when you get to that end.
Yeah, you are absolutely correct. I'm not sure if Richard has found what he's looking for, but has anyone got any other questions or comments they would like to make? No, I think I know what you're searching for, Richard. It's
yes, I am. Yeah.
A little plug here. It's in our book on Max. I can't remember which chapter, but
exactly that's what I'm trying.
But I'm sure that anyone who's got a copy can just look.
I mean, it comes as part of the death chord, but that's D, F sharp, E, G sharp. But I don't think that was a symbolism. But I don't think it's entirely related to that. There's something about one of the last works which I was trying to find.
Okay.
But I didn't. I mean, I can always add it later.
Please do, and let me know if you find some relation.
May I ask, if no one else has got a question, I've just got one final question for you, Dimitri. And that is, you've talked about the Strathclyde Concerto number 4 and the hymn to Artemis Lockyer. I just want to ask you a question about Max's earlier pieces for clarinet and whether you've looked at those. I mean, 2 immediately spring to mind: Stedman doubles from the 1950s, and that was revised at the end of the 1960s. But the most iconic piece which Max wrote, or one of them, in the late 1960s, was Hymnos for clarinet. Yes. I mean, I just, you've got that anguished expressionist sort of style there, and the concerto is much more mellow and lyrical in character. I just wondered if you've looked at those earlier pieces.
And I looked at the hymnos part at one point. I also looked at the 7 brightnesses.
Yes.
Which I didn't look at for terribly long because I just thought I'm never going to be able to play this. I can't say that I know either one well enough to make a qualified remark on them. But as far as the anguish that you mentioned, I mean, I would have to listen to them and maybe even practice them to have a better idea. But it sounds like the anguish is more immediately palpable in it. Whereas, will you confirm that?
Yes, absolutely.
Because in the concerto, I feel that the anguish is deeper lying. It's something that it's almost existential, and not only personal, but for like all of humanity kind of anguish. So maybe that's part of Max's path then. I mean, these were 20 years earlier, 20 to 30 years earlier than the
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Hymnos comes at the period of 8 Songs for Mad King and other pieces like that. So it comes in a particularly turbulent moment in Max's own personal life, and that this just tumbles out into the music. So you would expect that piece to reflect that. I should
listen to that before I make any kind of comment. I would love to, and in fact, I'm going to do it soon because now you've mentioned it. I think I should listen to them.
There's a future project.
He did actually refer to that decade between 1962 and 72 or 73 as the terrible years. He kept referring to it as those. So the angst, comes out in the music. There's no diaries for them, so we don't.
Do you know what would he have been referring to specifically? Do you know?
Well, I mean, for the first part, he was in America, and I think that was an interesting experience. He doesn't write very much about it, but then he came back, and almost immediately he's into this what you might call the neo-expressionist period of his writing, of which Hymnos is one. I'm pretty sure part of it was coming to terms with his sexuality.
Right.
But I think there must have been. He calls himself coming to terms with the Antichrist in himself.
Ooh.
That's pretty. I mean, he did write a piece called Antichrist at that time as well. So it's, I mean, this is what I mean about a lot of what he writes has this biographical sort of reflection. And of course, the Antichrist doesn't just appear there; it appears also as Versailles Icones, and it's a kind of
fascinating. Because when I met him, he must have already gone through an amazing journey then, because I didn't feel that he was struggling with that particular element any longer at all.
No, I think by that time he'd come through the terrible years, but he still referred back to them in his personal, personal reflections. He was always going back to it. More times than you'd be surprisingly number of times, but he didn't refer to it elsewhere. In fact, in some ways, the 8 Songs for Mad King in the end annoyed him because of the amount of publicity it got and continued to get.
Yeah. I remember that he mentioned that he didn't feel that reflected his artistic message, as well as something that was enjoying that success should have.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Just one final opportunity to ask Dimitri a question. But if not, then I would. I think we'll wrap up there. And thank you so much again. It was a really fascinating talk, and thank you so much for agreeing to contribute to our series.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure. Our pleasure.
If I may just say, as I mentioned before, that I'm in the process of trying to collect enough funding to get this recording released. If anybody is listening and wants to, please, I don't know, how should we do it? Contact somebody, contact me. I don't know. Can anybody contact me on the basis of this talk? I don't know. But I have a GoFundMe page, which is still up and running. So if anybody's interested, please go and check it out.
I think what we'll do, Dimitri, is once the recording has been uploaded to YouTube, I can put if you send me, I've got the link. I can then put the link underneath the YouTube
great
video, so people can actually see it and link to it. So we can highlight it that way.
Cool. Thank you.
So
it's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to remind you, I think this is our last Friday forum before the summer break. We will be back in the new academic year in the autumn. So please look out for emails and messages from us. But enjoy the rest of your day. It's not very sunny here, but I'm sure it'll brighten up over the weekend. But thank you again, and I'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.